I saved you from the biggest mistake of your life. You have a documented history of mental instability, and frankly, you are completely unfit to be married to anyone. My mother's voice was completely steady when she said those words over the phone. There was no apology, no guilt, just the cold and calculated tone of a woman who fully believed she had the right to play God with my life. That was exactly how I found out that my own mother had systematically destroyed my wedding. My name is Lena Whitmore. I am 31 years old, and I work as a high school teacher. I live in Ashford Creek, North Carolina, a tight-knit town with a population of about 6,800 people. In a place this small, everyone knows your business, and your family's reputation is everything. My mother, Caroline Whitmore, is practically royalty in our local community. She serves on endless committees, organizes charity events, and cares about public perception more than she cares about her own family. My fiancé, Ethan Cole, is the exact opposite of her. He is a carpenter and a custom interior designer. He works with his hands, builds beautiful things from scratch, and is the kindest, most grounded man I have ever known. Exactly 5 days before our wedding day, everything fell apart. I was sitting at my kitchen table, going over some final details and seating arrangements. I decided to call our catering company just to confirm the timeline for the rehearsal dinner. The woman on the phone sounded hesitant, almost nervous when she heard my name. "Ms. Whitmore, your wedding was canceled on Monday," she said. I actually laughed. I thought it was a bad joke or a typo in their system. But she insisted. She said a woman claiming to be me had called, verified all my personal details, and canceled the entire contract. Panic started to rise in my chest, making it hard to breathe. I hung up the phone and immediately called our florist. Canceled. I called the reception venue. Canceled. Frantically, I dialed the photographer and the live band. Canceled and canceled. Every single vendor I had booked over the last 9 months was gone. All the deposits and final payments, totaling exactly $42,500, were forfeited or completely lost. The person who did this was my own mother, but the massive financial loss and the canceled vendors were not even the worst part of it all. When Ethan came home from his workshop and saw me crying on the floor, he sat down next to me and confessed something that made my blood run cold. My mother hadn't just canceled the wedding behind my back. She had actually cornered him earlier that week. She looked him dead in the eye and told him that I had a severe history of mental illness, that I was mentally unstable, and that I was unfit to get married. She told him he needed to walk away immediately before I ruined his life. To understand how my own mother could do something so incredibly vicious, we have to go back to the beginning. 9 months ago, Ethan proposed to me, and it happened exactly the way I wanted it to. We were standing in his dusty garage while he was working. He was right in the middle of building a solid wood dining table for a client. He just put his tools down, wiped his hands on his jeans, and pulled a small box out of his pocket. It wasn't a massive, flashy diamond. It was a beautiful, delicate vintage ring. I didn't care about the size of the stone. I cared about the man giving it to me. I said yes immediately, crying into his shirt. We were so happy. For exactly 8 minutes after I put that ring on my finger, my phone rang. It was my mother. I hadn't called or texted anyone yet, but somehow, in a town like Ashford Creek, she already knew. I answered, expecting her to scream with joy. Instead, there was no congratulations. There was no "I'm so happy for you." Her very first sentence to me was, "Where is the wedding venue?" I should have known right then that this was going to be a massive battle. I told her we were just going to figure it out later, but she was already demanding dates, locations, and guest counts. In the beginning, her intrusion was small. She would call and say, "Let me help you call the vendors. You are so busy with grading papers and teaching, let me handle the boring stuff." It sounded like a nice gesture from a mother wanting to help her daughter. So, I foolishly let her help. That was the biggest mistake I could have made. Her help quickly turned into absolute control. It started with the emails. We had set up a joint email account for all the wedding planning, and one day I couldn't log in. She had changed the password entirely, claiming it was just easier for her to manage the vendor communications directly without me getting confused. Then she started changing my choices. I had a very clear vision for my wedding day. I wanted a rustic, relaxed vibe. I specifically asked the florist for lots of sunflowers and bright wildflowers. A few weeks later, I managed to see an updated invoice. My mother had completely removed my sunflowers and replaced them with expensive, imported white orchids. When I confronted her about it, she coldly told me that sunflowers were cheap and tacky, and she would absolutely not let her friends see such an ugly display at a wedding associated with her name. Then she went after the food. Ethan and I love good, hearty food. We ordered a massive barbecue buffet. We wanted our guests to eat well, grab a beer, and feel completely comfortable. My mother called the caterer behind my back and changed the entire menu to a stiff, formal 5-course plated dinner. She told me a buffet was basically feeding people out of troughs, and it would embarrass the family. Even the guest list wasn't safe from her. She started slashing my close college friends and Ethan's relatives off the list to make room for her own associates, people I hadn't seen since I was a toddler, and local politicians she wanted to impress. She wasn't planning my wedding. She was planning a high-society networking event for herself, and Ethan and I were just the props she needed to make it happen. Even my Uncle Raymond, my dad's younger brother, tried to warn me to set boundaries. But I just kept arguing with her, changing things back to the way I wanted them, thinking she would eventually give up. I didn't realize that my resistance was only making her angrier. She couldn't handle the fact that I was saying no to her. She couldn't stand that Ethan supported my decisions instead of bending to her. My best friend and maid of honor, Maya Torres, saw it all happening. Maya and I have been best friends since we were little kids. She is sharp, fiercely protective, and she doesn't trust easily. One afternoon, while we were looking at bridesmaid dresses, Maya looked at me with a very serious, calculating expression. "Lena, your mother is losing her mind over this," Maya said, lowering her voice. "If one day all of this just magically disappears, don't panic." I actually laughed out loud at her. I thought she was just being dramatic. I thought she was making a sarcastic joke about my mother's controlling nature. Sure, my mom was overbearing and annoying, but she wouldn't actually sabotage her own daughter's wedding. Right. I couldn't fathom that a mother would go that far just to prove a point, but Maya wasn't joking. Maya saw the massive storm coming long before I did. And while I was busy fighting my mother over orchids and barbecue sauce, Maya was quietly doing something else. She was quietly building a safety net behind the scenes. She had already started making backup plans. While my mother was plotting to destroy my big day, my best friend was preparing to save it. But before we could even get to that point, my mother decided to escalate her tactics. If she couldn't completely control the wedding, she was going to make sure the wedding never happened at all. To truly comprehend the absolute madness of my mother's plan, you have to look at what she was doing behind the scenes 3 months before the wedding day. When she realized that changing my napkin colors and altering the flower arrangements wasn't enough to force Ethan and me into submission, she shifted her entire strategy. She stopped trying to control the wedding and started trying to destroy my reputation entirely. She launched a full-blown smear campaign against her own daughter. It started with a phone call to Ethan's mother. My mother actually picked up the phone, called her future in-law, and fabricated a completely horrific story. She told Ethan's mom that I had a documented history of severe mental breakdowns. She lied through her teeth, claiming that I had been hospitalized in the past for psychiatric issues and that I was far too fragile to handle the pressure of being a wife. It was completely insane. I had never been hospitalized for anything in my life other than getting my tonsils removed when I was a kid. But she played the part of the deeply concerned, grieving mother so perfectly. Ethan's mom, a sweet and simple woman who lived 2 states away, was completely confused and terrified. Thankfully, she immediately called Ethan, who calmly shut the lie down, but my mother didn't stop there. She took her campaign to the streets of Ashford Creek. In a town of 6,800 people, whispers spread like wildfire, and my mother knew exactly how to fan the flames. She started going to her committee meetings, church gatherings, and local coffee shops, whispering to anyone who would listen. She would put on this incredibly sad, pitiful face and tell people that I was just completely unstable. She painted a picture of a fragile, broken girl who was losing her mind under the stress of planning a wedding. I would walk into the local grocery store and catch people staring at me with deep pity or whispering behind their hands. I didn't understand why at the time, but the rumors were spreading exactly the way she wanted them to. Then came the final attack, exactly 5 days before the wedding. As I mentioned earlier, she didn't just call the vendors and pretend to be me to cancel everything. She wanted an airtight alibi to ensure the cancellations were permanent. She logged into that joint wedding email account she had hijacked months ago and sent out an official cancellation email to every single vendor on our list. The subject line of that email was chilling. She wrote that the wedding was canceled due to a severe medical emergency. She used the false narrative she had been building for 3 months to make the vendors believe I had literally snapped and ended up in a hospital somewhere. That was exactly how she got them to shut down the contracts, tear up the schedules, and keep the non-refundable deposits without questioning it. When the truth fully hit me, the reality of it physically knocked the wind out of my lungs. I remember sitting on the cold kitchen floor, surrounded by useless wedding spreadsheets, fabric swatches, and seating charts, just feeling my entire world cave in. I called her. I needed to hear her say it. I needed to know how she could look in the mirror after doing this to her own flesh and blood. When she answered the phone, she didn't even try to deny it. She proudly stated that she had saved me from the biggest mistake of my life. She felt completely justified. She felt like a hero who had intervened in a tragedy. I dropped the phone on the floor. The betrayal was so deep, so vile, and so intimately cruel that my brain couldn't even process the grief. I just sat there and completely broke down. Ethan walked through the front door a few hours later, still wearing his work boots and covered in sawdust. I was a completely broken mess. I had to look at this man, the man I loved more than anything in the world, and tell him that our wedding was gone. I told him about the vendors. I told him about the massive amount of money that had vanished into thin air because of cancellation penalties. We had absolutely no venue. We had no food to feed our guests. We had no flowers, and we had absolutely no money left in our savings to fix any of it. We were completely drained, both financially and emotionally. I looked at him, tears streaming down my face, fully expecting him to just walk out the door. Who could blame him? Marrying into my family was turning into a toxic nightmare. But Ethan didn't run. He didn't yell, and he didn't even flinch. He just dropped his tool belt on the floor, knelt down next to me, pulled me into his chest, and held me tightly. He let me cry until my lungs burned and I couldn't breathe. Then, he pulled back, looked me right in the eyes, and said the words that kept me from completely losing my mind. "We are still getting married," he said, his voice completely calm and unshaken, that he told me he didn't care if we had to stand in our own driveway in our regular clothes and say our vows in front of a neighbor. He didn't care if we ate frozen pizza afterwards. He was going to marry me on that Saturday, no matter what my mother did or what lies she spread. Just as I was trying to wrap my head around his incredible support, the front door swung open. Maya walked in. She didn't knock. She didn't look frantic, and she didn't look surprised by the fact that I was crying on the floor. She took one look at me, took a look at Ethan holding me, and let out a long, heavy sigh. She was dragging a massive, hard-shell suitcase behind her. She rolled it right into the middle of my kitchen, lifted it up with both hands, and slammed it down onto my dining table. The loud thud made both Ethan and me jump. "Get up," Maya said, her voice strictly business. "Stop crying. We have a lot of work to do." She unzipped the suitcase and flipped it open. Inside, it was completely packed to the brim with thick manila folders, printed spreadsheets, and signed contracts. I stood up slowly, wiping my face, and stared at the suitcase in complete confusion. I asked her what all of this was and where it came from. Maya looked at me with a fiercely proud, almost dangerous smile. "I have been waiting for this exact day for 9 months," she told me. Maya sat us down and explained everything. She knew my mother was going to pull the plug. She saw the absolute madness in my mother's eyes from the very first week of planning. She knew that a woman who cared that much about absolute control would never let a wedding happen unless it was entirely on her own terms. So, while my mother was busy plotting to destroy my big day, Maya was quietly spending her evenings and weekends building an entire shadow wedding behind the scenes. She pulled out a thick red folder and handed it to me. It was a fully signed, fully paid contract for a massive, stunning location called the Silverbrook Orchard Estate. It was exactly the kind of rustic, beautiful, outdoor space I had originally begged my mother for before she forced us into a stuffy ballroom. "I booked it on a contingency plan 6 months ago," Maya explained, casually pulling out more folders and tossing them onto the table. "And I didn't stop there." She threw down another contract. A brand new florist who specialized in wildflowers. Another folder hit the table. A completely new caterer that specialized in the exact barbecue menu I had wanted from day one. another folder, a new photographer, a new DJ, and a massive order for beautiful string light decor. She had literally recreated my entire dream wedding from scratch. She had called in favors, used her own savings to hold deposits, and secured everything with local business owners who knew and hated my mother's controlling ways that I was looking at a miracle in a suitcase. But the biggest challenge was still ahead of us. We had a wedding again, but we only had a few days to pull off the greatest bait and switch this town had ever seen. Maya sat down at my kitchen table, opened her laptop, and pulled up a massive spreadsheet that completely made my jaw drop. The original guest list had exactly 260 people on it. My mother had fiercely guarded the RSVPs from the very beginning, insisting that she needed to be the one to collect all the response cards and manage the dietary restrictions. But she had severely underestimated Maya's meticulous and protective nature. Over the past 9 months, Maya had quietly documented every single phone number, email address, and physical mailing address for all 260 guests on that list. She had spent countless hours manually cross-referencing my mother's handwritten notes, looking up old friends on social media, and building a completely independent, secret database. Maya looked at Ethan and me with a serious expression and explained her master plan to completely hijack the wedding right back from the woman who had tried to destroy it. The strategy was incredibly risky but absolutely brilliant. If we told people about the new venue too early, the gossip would inevitably reach my mother's ears, and she would undoubtedly find a way to ruin the new plans. In a small town like Ashford Creek, secrets do not stay hidden for long, especially when my mother had eyes and ears everywhere. So, Maya proposed a total information blackout. On the actual morning of the wedding, Maya and my trusted bridesmaids would execute a massive, highly coordinated communication strike. They would send a personalized text message and a detailed email blast with the new location directly to every single guest on the list. They would explain that there had been a last-minute logistical emergency with the original venue, but the wedding was absolutely still happening as scheduled. The only person on the entire planet who would not receive that critical update was my mother, Caroline. The next 4 days were an absolute blur of secret meetings, rapid-fire decisions, and sheer adrenaline. Ethan and I drained what little money we had left in a separate, private bank account to pay Maya back for the deposits she had fronted with her own savings. We drove out to the Silverbrook Orchard Estate late at night to finalize the layout with the new vendors, sneaking out of our own neighborhood like teenagers trying not to get caught. Every single time my phone rang with my mother's name flashing on the caller ID, my heart would pound, but I let it go straight to voicemail. She left several voicemails dripping with fake sympathy, telling me how heartbroken she was that a sudden medical emergency had forced the vendors to cancel. She even had the audacity to offer to come over and comfort me in my time of grief. The sheer sickness of her lies made my stomach physically churn, but Ethan kept me completely grounded. He constantly reminded me that the absolute best revenge was simply having the wedding of our dreams without her permission. The morning of the wedding finally arrived, and the air in my hotel room was thick with nervous, electric energy. I sat in a chair getting my hair and makeup done while Maya sat on the bed, staring at her laptop screen like a military commander preparing for battle. At exactly 8 o'clock in the morning, she took a deep breath and pressed send. We watched in absolute silence as the delivery reports flooded into her system. 259 text messages and emails were successfully delivered to our friends and family. Almost immediately, my phone started blowing up with replies from confused but incredibly supportive guests confirming they would be at the new location. We had actually done it. We had successfully redirected an entire wedding in a matter of seconds without my mother suspecting a single thing. When Ethan and I finally arrived at the Silverbrook Orchard Estate that afternoon, I stepped out of the car and instantly burst into happy, overwhelmed tears. It was exactly what I had always wanted, down to the very last rustic detail. The venue was absolutely breathtaking. Thousands of delicate string lanterns were glowing warmly as they were strung between the thick branches of the ancient apple trees. The late afternoon sun filtered through the green leaves, creating a golden, magical atmosphere that felt like something out of a movie. A fantastic live band was already set up on a rustic wooden stage, tuning their instruments and playing a soft, acoustic melody that drifted across the grass. The incredible, mouth-watering smell of rich barbecue smoke floated through the crisp air from the massive catering tents set up near the edge of the property. There were no stuffy, imported white orchids, no rigid five-course plated meals, and no suffocating rules. It was just pure, relaxed joy, exactly the way Ethan and I had envisioned it from the very beginning. Everything was absolutely perfect, and the guests were already arriving, laughing and grabbing drinks from the open bar. Meanwhile, on the other side of town, my mother was executing what she fully believed would be her ultimate victory lap. We pieced together exactly what happened later from various family members who witnessed her absolute meltdown. Caroline had actually gotten fully dressed up in her expensive, custom-tailored mother-of-the-bride outfit. She confidently drove herself to the original reception venue, fully expecting to find a scene of absolute devastation and public chaos. She likely wanted to be the center of attention, offering her fake tears and dramatic, public apologies to the confused guests who showed up to a canceled party. But when she pulled her luxury SUV into the parking lot, there was absolutely no one there. The heavy glass doors of the building were completely locked, the lot was totally empty, and there was no sign of a wedding anywhere. It was just a barren stretch of concrete and a silent, abandoned building. Panic and extreme confusion must have set in almost immediately. She sat in her car and started frantically making phone calls to figure out why she was completely alone. She called my cell phone first, but I had already handed it over to Maya with strict instructions to ignore it. She called Ethan's phone, which was completely turned off and sitting in his locker. Getting no answers from the bride and groom, she started aggressively dialing anyone in the family she could think of. She called Maya, who simply let it ring out with a massive smirk on her face. She called my Aunt Gloria, who was already at the orchard happily holding a plate of brisket, and Gloria didn't even hear her phone vibrating over the sound of the live band playing. The absolute silence was driving my mother completely insane. She had orchestrated this massive, destructive, calculated plan, and absolutely no one was reacting the way she had expected. Finally, after nearly an hour of sitting alone in an empty parking lot, my mother managed to get someone on the line. She called a distant, older relative who wasn't exactly up to speed on the intense, toxic family drama. This older relative answered the phone cheerfully, with the loud, joyful background noise of our live band playing clearly through the speaker. My mother angrily demanded to know where everyone was and why the original venue was completely locked up. The older relative, completely innocent and totally unaware of the secret information blackout, casually slipped up and dropped the absolute bomb. They cheerfully told my mother that everyone was having a wonderful time and that the entire wedding had simply been moved to the Silverbrook Orchard estate. The moment those words registered in my mother's brain, all of her carefully crafted public composure completely shattered into a million pieces. The realization that she had been utterly outsmarted, that her daughter had successfully bypassed her total control, and that 259 people were currently attending a massive, beautiful party without her was way too much for her fragile ego to handle. She didn't just get mad, she became completely unhinged. She slammed her foot on the gas pedal and began driving like an absolute maniac across town, determined to crash the event and tear the whole thing down with her bare hands. She was heading straight for the orchard, completely unaware that her absolute worst nightmare was actually waiting for her right at the front gates. My mother's silver SUV tore down the gravel road leading to the Silverbrook Orchard estate, kicking up a massive cloud of dust behind her. She was driving recklessly, running stop signs and swerving around slower vehicles, her mind entirely consumed by the fact that she had been utterly outplayed. She fully intended to march right up to the altar, grab a microphone out of the officiant's hands, and shut the entire event down by sheer force of will. She assumed that because she was Caroline Whitmore, the undisputed queen of Ashford Creek's high society, people would simply part like the Red Sea and let her do whatever she wanted. But Maya and I knew my mother better than anyone, and we had prepared for this exact scenario. When she finally slammed on her brakes at the main entrance of the orchard, she did not find a welcoming committee. Instead, she was met by two massive, unsmiling private security guards standing in front of a heavy iron gate. We had explicitly hired them for the day, using the last bit of money we had pooled together, and we had given them exactly one job: keep Caroline Whitmore off the property. My mother rolled down her window and immediately started barking orders, demanding that they open the gates for the mother of the bride. The taller of the two guards calmly leaned down, checked his clipboard, and flatly told her that her name was not on the approved guest list. That was the exact moment my mother completely lost her mind. She threw her car into park, aggressively pushed her way out of the driver's seat, and started screaming at the top of her lungs. She threatened to have the guards arrested. She threatened to sue the venue, and she demanded that they go get me immediately. She was completely red in the face, waving her arms, and throwing a massive, entirely unhinged tantrum right there in the dirt driveway. She insulted the guards, called them names, and demanded to speak to the owner of the estate, completely oblivious to how ridiculous she looked. But here is the absolute best part, the one detail my mother could never have anticipated in a million years. She wasn't just screaming at two security guards. She was screaming directly into the lens of a professional television camera. Earlier that week, when Maya was furiously calling vendors and cashing in favors to save the day, word had started to spread among the local business owners. A caterer mentioned it to a florist, who mentioned it to a photographer, who happened to be married to a producer for the local county news station. The news station loved the incredible human interest angle of the situation. They wanted to run a feel-good evening segment titled, "Bride Saves Wedding After Family Sabotage," highlighting how the local community of Ashford Creek had banded together at the very last second to rescue our big day. The news crew had been stationed near the front gates, getting some beautiful B-roll footage of the venue and the arriving guests. When my mother's SUV came screeching to a halt, they caught absolutely everything on tape. They filmed her screaming, swearing, and physically trying to push past the security guards in her expensive, custom-tailored designer dress. They caught the absolute ugly, vicious truth of who Lena Whitmore really was, entirely unfiltered and completely unedited. Every nasty word, every entitled demand, and every frantic attempt to ruin her own daughter's wedding was permanently captured in high definition. While she was having a massive public meltdown at the gates, Ethan and I were completely oblivious, standing under a beautiful floral archway surrounded by our real friends and supportive family members. We said our vows, we exchanged our rings, and we kissed as the crowd erupted into cheers. It was the most peaceful, perfect moment of my entire life. We spent the rest of the evening eating incredible, smoky barbecue, dancing under the warm string lights, and laughing until our stomachs physically hurt. I didn't think about my mother once. I was completely surrounded by love and genuine happiness. We didn't even know my mother had tried to crash the wedding until much later that night. By the time Ethan and I finally got back to our hotel room, exhausted but incredibly happy, my mother's life was already rapidly dismantling itself. The local news station didn't even wait for the evening broadcast to share the footage of her gate-crashing incident. The producer knew exactly what kind of absolute gold they had captured, so they immediately uploaded a raw, unedited clip directly to their social media pages. Within a matter of hours, that video was shared absolutely everywhere. It was posted on Facebook, it was heavily circulated in the town's private community group, and it was sent around the local church community text chains. Everyone in Ashford Creek saw it. In a town of 6,800 people, reputation is absolutely everything, and my mother's reputation was utterly destroyed in less than 48 hours. All the people she had lied to, all the committee members she had manipulated with her fake tears about my mental instability, were now watching her act like an absolute lunatic. The pristine, upper-class image she had spent decades carefully building was completely gone, replaced by the harsh reality of a bitter, controlling woman who tried to ruin her own daughter's happiness. People were leaving hundreds of comments, calling out her toxic behavior and expressing their shock. The next morning, as we were sitting in bed drinking coffee and scrolling through the absolute chaos unfolding online, Ethan turned to me with a very serious look on his face. He reached into his overnight bag, pulled out his phone, and set it on the bed between us. He told me that there was something else I needed to know, something he had been keeping a secret because he didn't want to add to my massive amount of stress before the wedding. Ethan revealed that he had actually recorded the phone call my mother had made to him months ago, the one where she tried to convince him to cancel the engagement. Because Ethan used his phone for his carpentry business and frequently dealt with difficult clients and verbal contracts, he used an app that automatically recorded all of his incoming business calls. He pressed play, and the room went completely silent as my mother's cold, calculated voice filled the air. Did I listen to her tell Ethan that I was fundamentally broken? My daughter is broken, her voice echoed from the phone speaker. She is mentally unfit, she is unstable, and if you marry her, she will absolutely ruin your life and your business. Walk away now, Ethan. Hearing her say those exact words, in that precise, chilling tone, sent a fresh wave of absolute anger through my entire body. She hadn't just exaggerated a few details, she had actively, maliciously tried to destroy my future husband's perception of me. She wanted me to be alone, single, and completely miserable just so she could maintain her sick control over my life. It was the ultimate betrayal. Ethan looked at me and asked what I wanted to do with the audio file. He said it was entirely my choice. We could delete it, ignore it, and move on with our lives, or we could use it to permanently shut down any remaining sympathy she might try to scrounge up from her few remaining loyal friends that I didn't even have to think about it for a second. I had spent my entire life shrinking myself down to make my mother comfortable. I had spent 31 years apologizing for things I didn't do, changing my own preferences to suit her tastes, and allowing her to dictate my reality. She had tried to steal my wedding, steal my money, and steal my sanity. I was absolutely done protecting her from the consequences of her own actions. I took Ethan's phone, attached the audio recording file to an email, and sent it directly to the reporter who had covered the story at the front gates. I knew exactly what would happen once the press had their hands on undeniable proof of her calculated smear campaign. It was the final nail in the coffin of her public image, and as I hit send, I didn't feel a single ounce of guilt. I hit send on that email, attaching the audio file of my mother calling me mentally unfit and broken, and I didn't feel a single ounce of regret. I watched the little progress bar load on my screen and then disappear, officially sending the absolute truth directly to the local news reporter. For 31 years, I had been the quiet, compliant daughter, working as a high school teacher and always avoiding conflict. I had let my mother dictate my life, my choices, and my boundaries because it was simply easier than fighting her. But sitting there in that hotel room, officially married to the love of my life, something inside me had fundamentally shifted. I was no longer interested in protecting Caroline Whitmore's pristine public image, especially when she had been so willing to completely destroy mine. The reporter replied to my email in less than 15 minutes. She asked for a written confirmation that I was granting the news station full permission to broadcast the audio file. I typed back a simple yes. That evening, Ethan and I were back in our own small house, unpacking our overnight bags and eating leftover barbecue from the reception. We turned on the television to watch the local 6 o'clock news. In a small town like Ashford Creek, which only has a population of about 6,800 people, the evening broadcast is usually filled with incredibly boring local updates. But tonight, the lead story was the highly anticipated follow-up to the viral video of my mother's meltdown. The anchor introduced the piece, explaining that new, exclusive evidence had surfaced regarding the lengths to which a prominent local figure went to ruin her own daughter's special day. Then, they played the audio tape on live television. Sitting on my couch, I heard my mother's cold, calculating voice broadcast into thousands of living rooms across the entire county. My daughter is broken. Her voice echoed loudly through the television speakers. She sounded so incredibly confident, so utterly convinced of her own sick lies. The news segment didn't even try to soften the blow for her. They juxtaposed the audio recording with the video footage of her screaming at the security guards in her expensive dress. The massive contrast between her fake, concerned tone on the phone and her completely unhinged behavior at the gates was glaringly obvious to everyone watching. It was the absolute destruction of her carefully curated persona, broadcast for everyone to see. The fallout was instantaneous and absolutely massive. My mother's reputation was completely destroyed in exactly 48 hours. By Tuesday morning, the entire town was buzzing with the scandal. Maya, my maid of honor and best friend since childhood, came over to my house with 2 massive cups of iced coffee and a completely satisfied smirk on her face. Maya knew absolutely everything that was happening in town because she had eyes and ears everywhere. She sat down at my kitchen table and gave me the full, detailed rundown of my mother's rapid social decline. For over a decade, my mother had been the undisputed president of the Ashford Creek Women's Association. It was a highly exclusive, prestigious local committee that organized charity galas and essentially dictated the social hierarchy of the town. On Tuesday afternoon, the board members held an emergency, closed-door meeting without her. They voted unanimously to remove her from her position as president and officially kicked her out of the women's club entirely. They actually sent a courier to her house with a formal, legally drafted letter demanding that she step down from all committee duties immediately. They cited that her recent public behavior was a severe violation of their code of conduct and an absolute embarrassment to their organization. But the professional and organizational isolation wasn't even the worst of it for her. It was the intense personal rejection. Her so-called friends completely stopped returning her phone calls, and the women who used to visit her porch to gossip cut off all contact. Maya told me that my mother had actually tried to walk into the local country club for her usual Tuesday lunch appointment, acting as if nothing had happened at all. As soon as she stepped into the main dining room, people literally turned their chairs away from her. The wait staff, who usually treated her like royalty, were entirely curt and professional, refusing to engage in any small talk. Absolutely no one wanted to be associated with the woman who had faked a medical emergency to cancel her daughter's wedding and then lied about her daughter's mental health to the groom. The complete social freeze-out was absolute and ruthless. Uncle Raymond, my dad's younger brother, called me later that evening. He had always been a very quiet man who usually tried to stay completely out of the toxic family drama. But even he couldn't stay silent after seeing the evening news broadcast. He told me that he had driven past my mother's massive house earlier that day. He said all the heavy curtains were drawn completely shut, and her silver SUV was parked tightly in the garage. She had locked herself inside, completely unable to face the town that was now actively and loudly rejecting her. Uncle Raymond told me he was incredibly proud of me. He said I had done the hardest thing a person could do by finally standing up to a massive bully, even when that bully was my own mother. Hearing him say that validated every single difficult decision Ethan, Maya, and I had made over the last few days. Through all of this absolute chaos, Ethan remained my completely solid ground. While the rest of the town was obsessing over the scandal and my mother was hiding behind her closed curtains, Ethan simply went back to work. He is a carpenter and a custom interior designer, and he finds his ultimate peace in building things from scratch. I would sit on a tall wooden stool in his dusty garage, just watching him measure, cut, and sand heavy pieces of oak and walnut for his clients. The familiar smell of sawdust and wood glue became incredibly comforting to me during that highly stressful week. We didn't talk about my mother. We didn't talk about the viral video or the news broadcast. We just talked about our future together and the life we were going to build. We talked about paying off the massive debt from the canceled vendors, expanding his carpentry business, and finally taking a real honeymoon later in the year once our bank accounts recovered. I realized that my mother's biggest, most vocal fear had actually come true, but not in the way she had planned at all. She was absolutely right that someone's life was going to be completely ruined by this wedding event. But it wasn't Ethan's life, and it certainly wasn't mine. It was hers. She had carefully dug her own grave with her constant lies and extreme manipulation, and now she was being forced to lie in it, entirely alone and completely disgraced. We had finally won our freedom, and we were never going to let her take it away from us again. The days immediately following the news broadcast were incredibly strange, to say the least. For my entire life, my mother had been the loudest, most dominant presence in my world. If she wasn't physically in the room, she was calling my phone, leaving passive-aggressive voicemails, or orchestrating some kind of drama behind the scenes. But now, for the first time in 31 years, there was just absolute, uninterrupted silence from her end. She had completely locked herself inside her large, empty house, hiding behind her heavy drawn curtains as the town of Ashford Creek collectively turned its back on her. You would think that the silence would bring me immediate peace, but honestly, it just felt heavy and unresolved. The local gossip was finally starting to die down, and people were moving on to the next small-town scandal, but I was still carrying a massive amount of emotional baggage. I realized that simply exposing her actions to the local news and watching her reputation crumble wasn't enough to heal the deep wounds she had caused. I needed to actually speak to her, not to argue or defend myself, but to officially close the door on our toxic relationship that I knew that calling her was completely out of the question. If I called her, she would either ignore the phone or use the opportunity to scream, cry, and twist the narrative to make herself the victim. A face-to-face conversation was even worse. She would just try to physically intimidate me the way she always did. So, exactly 1 week after my wedding day, I sat down at the exact same kitchen table where I had once cried over all those canceled vendor contracts, and I pulled out a blank piece of paper. I made the firm decision to write her a letter. I wanted to put my final thoughts down in ink, creating a physical boundary that she could not manipulate, interrupt, or talk over. Writing that letter was the hardest thing I have ever had to do. I stared at the blank page for nearly an hour, not knowing how to summarize 3 decades of manipulation, control, and absolute betrayal. I thought about the fake medical emergency she had invented. I thought about the vicious lies she told Ethan's mother. I thought about how she had systematically tried to destroy the happiest day of my life just to prove a point. But as I sat there, listening to the faint sound of Ethan's electric saw buzzing out in his garage workshop, the anger slowly started to drain out of me. I realized that I didn't want to write a hateful letter. Hating her required energy, and I simply didn't have any left to give her. I just wanted to be free. I finally picked up my pen and started writing. I didn't use any fancy language or long, drawn-out explanations. I went straight to the point. I told her that I knew exactly what she had done, from the very first changed password on our joint wedding email to the final, frantic attempt to crash the venue at the Silverbrook Orchard Estate. I told her that I had heard the recording of her telling Ethan that I was broken and mentally unfit. I laid out all the facts plainly, without any emotional embellishment, so she couldn't pretend that this was just a simple misunderstanding. But the most important part of the letter, the absolute core message that I needed her to understand, came at the very end. I wrote down a single, defining sentence that finally broke the invisible chain she had wrapped around my neck for my entire life, simply stating that I loved her, but I absolutely did not belong to her. Those few words were incredibly powerful to me. They acknowledged the complicated, messy truth that she was still my mother and that a part of me would always care about her well-being. But they also firmly established that my life, my choices, and my future were absolutely not her property. I folded the letter, slid it into a plain white envelope, and sealed it tight. I didn't put a return address on it because I wasn't inviting a response. I didn't want an apology, and I didn't want an explanation. I just wanted her to know that her reign of terror over my life was officially over. I drove down to the local post office that same afternoon. I stood in front of the blue collection box on the sidewalk, holding the envelope in my hand for a long moment. It felt like I was holding a massive, heavy weight that I had been carrying on my shoulders since I was a little girl. When I finally let go and heard the envelope drop into the metal bin, a massive wave of relief washed over my entire body. It was done. The chapter was officially closed. I walked back to my car, got in, and for the first time in months, I didn't feel a knot of anxiety twisting in my stomach. I just felt completely light and free. The following Monday, I officially returned to my job as a high school teacher. I had taken a few extra days off around the wedding to deal with the absolute nightmare my mother had created, and I was honestly a little nervous to step back into the classroom. Ashford Creek is a small town, and I knew that the parents of my students had definitely seen the viral video and the evening news broadcast. I was worried that they would look at me differently, or pity me, or whisper about the scandal during parent-teacher conferences. But when I walked through the double doors of the high school that morning, something incredible happened. Nobody whispered. Nobody stared at me with pity. Several of my fellow teachers stopped me in the hallway, gave me warm hugs, and told me how absolutely beautiful my wedding photos looked online. A few of the older staff members, who had known my mother and her controlling ways for decades, just gave me quiet, knowing smiles of support. They didn't bring up the meltdown or the news report. They just treated me with genuine respect and kindness. It was a massive validation that I had done the right thing. I wasn't the broken, unstable girl my mother had tried to convince the town I was. I was a respected teacher, a good friend, and a strong woman who had finally stood up for herself. When I got back to the house that afternoon, Ethan was taking a break from his carpentry work, sitting on the front porch with a glass of ice water. He took one look at my face and immediately knew that something fundamental had changed. I sat down next to him, leaned my head on his shoulder, and told him about the letter. I told him exactly what I had written, including the final sentence about not belonging to her. Ethan didn't say anything at first. He just wrapped his arm around me and kissed the top of my head. He completely understood that this wasn't just about the wedding anymore. It was about me finally reclaiming my own identity and stepping out of the massive, suffocating shadow my mother had cast over my entire existence. That night, Maya came over for dinner, bringing a massive box of takeout from our favorite local diner. When I told her about the letter I had dropped in the mail, she literally raised her French fry in the air like she was giving a toast. Maya had always been fiercely protective of me, and she had spent the last 9 months watching my mother actively try to ruin my life. She told me that writing that letter was the bravest thing I had ever done. We spent the rest of the evening sitting on the living room floor, eating our food, and laughing about the absolute chaos of the past week. For the first time in a very long time, our conversation wasn't dominated by my mother's latest demands or her passive-aggressive threats. We talked about regular things. We talked about Maya's job, we talked about my students, and we talked about the beautiful wooden dining chairs Ethan was currently building for a new client. The absence of my mother's drama created this massive, beautiful empty space in my life, and I was finally starting to fill it with things that actually made me happy. I didn't have to check my phone every 5 minutes in a panic. I didn't have to second-guess my own decisions or wonder if my choices were going to embarrass the family. I was just Lena. I was a 31-year-old high school teacher, married to an incredible man, surrounded by people who genuinely loved and supported me. The letter was already making its way through the local postal system, moving closer and closer to that large, quiet house with the drawn curtains. I didn't know how she would react when she finally opened it and read those words. I didn't know if she would scream, cry, or just throw it in the trash. And honestly, for the absolute first time in my life, I truly did not care. The weeks following the day I dropped that final letter into the mailbox slowly turned into months, and for the absolute first time in my 31 years of life, I truly understood what genuine peace felt like. The silence from my mother's end of town remained absolute and unbroken. I didn't receive any frantic phone calls, no passive-aggressive text messages, and she never tried to show up at my front door to demand an explanation. But even with her completely out of the picture, Ethan and I still had a massive mountain to climb. The emotional relief was incredible, but the financial reality of what she had done was still hanging heavily over our heads. We had lost exactly $42,500 in forfeited deposits when my mother pretended to be me and canceled every single vendor. That kind of money is an absolutely devastating loss for a high school teacher and a carpenter who were just starting their lives together. We had completely drained our personal savings accounts just to pay Maya back for the secret shadow wedding she had planned. So we spent the first 6 months of our marriage living on an incredibly strict, unforgiving budget. But honestly, we didn't even care about the money because we finally had our freedom. Ethan simply put his head down and poured every single ounce of his energy into his custom interior design and carpentry business. He spent his early mornings and late nights out in his dusty garage workshop, measuring, cutting, and sanding beautiful pieces of wood while I graded high school history papers at the kitchen table. Before our wedding, when everything was completely falling apart, Ethan had spent his evenings handcrafting a set of gorgeous, intricate wooden chairs for our sweetheart table. We had used those exact chairs at the Silverbrook Orchard Estate, sitting in them while we ate our barbecue dinner under the warm glow of the string lanterns and the ancient apple trees. They were rustic, beautifully stained with a dark walnut finish, and perfectly matched the relaxed, wildflower aesthetic I had always dreamed of. After the wedding, we brought those chairs home and put them in our own small dining room. About 8 months into our marriage, something completely unexpected happened. The new photographer that Maya had hired at the absolute last minute for the wedding finally updated her professional portfolio online. She posted a beautifully edited photo gallery of our reception to her business social media pages. The pictures perfectly captured the magic of that evening, highlighting the gorgeous outdoor venue, the live band playing on the wooden stage, and the thick, sweet smell of barbecue smoke that seemed to hang in the air. But one of the photos she posted was a stunning close-up shot of the custom wooden wedding chairs Ethan had built. The photographer had taken the picture just as the sun was setting, catching the rich grain of the wood and the delicate wildflowers draped over the back of the seats. That single photograph somehow made its way out of our small-town social circle and was picked up by a massive wedding inspiration blog. Almost overnight, the picture of those chairs completely went viral online. People were absolutely obsessed with the incredible craftsmanship and the unique, rustic design. Couples who were planning their own weddings started desperately searching for the carpenter who had built them. Within a matter of days, Ethan's business email inbox was completely flooded with inquiries. People were practically begging him to build custom seating, beautiful rustic ceremony arches, and solid wood dining tables for their own upcoming events. The demand was so overwhelmingly high that orders started pouring in not just from Ashford Creek, but from all over the entire state of North Carolina. His woodworking business absolutely exploded in a way neither of us could have ever anticipated, and it was the most chaotic, exciting time of our lives. Ethan actually had to rent out a larger commercial workspace on the edge of town and hire 2 full-time apprentices just to keep up with the massive influx of custom orders. I would come home from teaching my high school classes, drop my bags by the door, and spend my entire evening helping him manage his new business spreadsheets, completely amazed by how fast our lives were changing. Within 10 months of the viral post, his business had generated enough profit that we entirely recouped the massive $42,500 my mother had stolen from us through those cancellation penalties. We were finally financially secure, our debts were completely paid off, and Ethan's reputation as a master craftsman was firmly established. The entire situation felt incredibly poetic to me. My mother had actively tried to ruin Ethan's business by calling his mother and spreading vicious, entirely fabricated rumors that my mental instability would absolutely drag his life and career down. She had completely convinced herself that without her money and her high society connections, we would fail miserably. Instead, the exact wedding she tried to destroy became the very catalyst that launched his career into something more successful than we could have ever imagined. Meanwhile, her own life remained entirely stagnant and isolated. In a tight-knit town with a population of about 6,800 people, there are absolutely no secrets. Even though I never asked anyone about her, Uncle Raymond would occasionally stop by our house for coffee and give us brief updates on the family. He told us that Caroline was still completely isolated in her massive home. Since she had been publicly humiliated on the local news, officially removed from the women's club, and her friends had completely cut off contact with her, she rarely ever left her property. Her reputation was permanently and entirely destroyed. She no longer had her committees, she no longer had her social power, and she no longer had her daughter to use as a prop. She was simply living alone with the absolute reality of the very lonely bed she had made for herself. As the 1-year mark of our marriage rapidly approached, Ethan and I felt an incredible sense of victory. We had survived the ultimate betrayal, we had navigated a massive financial crisis, and we had built a truly beautiful, peaceful life entirely on our own terms. We didn't need expensive imported white orchids or a stiff 5-course plated dinner to prove our worth. We just needed each other, our true friends like Maya, and the quiet confidence of knowing we had stood our ground. We started planning a small, intimate backyard dinner to celebrate our 1-year anniversary, fully believing that the toxic drama of my mother was permanently behind us forever. I truly thought the chapter was entirely closed and that I would never hear from Lena Whitmore again, but I was about to be proven wrong one final time. The exact date of our 1-year anniversary fell on a beautiful, clear Saturday. Ethan and I decided early on that we absolutely did not want to do anything massive or overly complicated to celebrate. After the absolute circus that surrounded our actual wedding day, the viral news broadcast, and the intense community fallout, we just craved the quiet comfort of our own home. We decided to host a very small, intimate backyard dinner, inviting only the core group of people who had actively helped us survive the absolute worst week of our lives. It was just going to be Ethan, myself, Maya, Uncle Raymond, and Ethan's mother, who had happily flown in from out of state just to spend the weekend with us. We wanted to recreate the exact magic of a Silverbrook orchard estate, but on a much smaller, deeply personal scale right in our own backyard. Early that Saturday morning, Ethan went out to his commercial workshop and brought back the exact set of custom wooden dining chairs that had completely changed our lives. He arranged them around our heavy patio table, and then he spent 2 hours stringing up delicate, warm lanterns across the wooden fence and through the branches of the large oak tree in our yard. I ordered a massive catering spread from the exact same local barbecue restaurant that Maya had hired for our shadow wedding. The rich, smoky smell of brisket and pulled pork filled the evening air, instantly transporting both of us back to that perfect, chaotic day. When our guests finally arrived, there was absolutely no stress, no hidden agendas, and no underlying tension. We just sat around the table, drank cold beers, ate incredible food, and laughed loudly into the night. During the dinner, Maya raised her glass and made a brief, highly emotional toast. She looked around the table and simply pointed out how far we had all come in exactly 12 months. She reminded us of that terrifying afternoon when I was sitting on the kitchen floor, crying over $42,500 in canceled contracts, fully believing my life was over. Now, Ethan was running a massively successful custom furniture business. Our debts were entirely paid off, and we were happier than we had ever been. Uncle Raymond chimed in with a quiet, very brief update from the other side of town. He told us that the massive house with the drawn curtains remained completely silent. Caroline Whitmore was still entirely isolated, entirely removed from her prestigious committees, and entirely alone. Hearing her name didn't cause my chest to tighten or my heart to race anymore. I didn't feel angry, and I didn't feel afraid. I just felt a quiet, profound sense of pity for a woman who had traded her own daughter for the illusion of total control, only to lose absolutely everything in the end. The dinner party wrapped up late in the evening, and we spent the rest of the night cleaning up the patio, feeling completely exhausted but incredibly fulfilled. The next morning, a quiet and lazy Sunday, Ethan went out to the garage to do some light sanding on a new project, and I decided to walk down the long gravel driveway to check our mailbox. It was a completely mundane, ordinary task. I wasn't expecting anything important, maybe just some local grocery flyers, a few utility bills, and some junk mail. I opened the small metal door of the mailbox, pulled out a stack of envelopes, and started absent-mindedly flipping through them as I walked back toward the front porch of our house. Right in the middle of the stack, there was a plain, slightly textured white envelope. It had absolutely no return address printed in the corner. But the moment my eyes landed on the front of the envelope, my feet completely stopped moving. I recognized the sharp, slanted, incredibly distinct handwriting immediately. It was my mother's handwriting. My name and my home address were written perfectly across the center in her heavy black ink. For a brief second, that old, familiar panic tried to rise in my throat. My brain instantly started spiraling, wondering what kind of legal threat, passive-aggressive essay, or toxic demand was waiting inside. I stood perfectly still on the gravel driveway, holding the envelope in both hands, taking a very long, deep breath. I reminded myself of the letter I had sent her nearly a year ago. I reminded myself of the boundary I had permanently established when I told her that I loved her, but I absolutely did not belong to her. I wasn't that terrified, compliant little girl anymore. I was a grown woman, standing in front of a house I paid for, legally married to a man who protected me. Whatever was inside this envelope could not hurt me unless I gave it the power to do, so that I walked into the house, went straight to the kitchen table, and sat down. The house was completely quiet except for the faint, comforting buzz of Ethan's saw out in the garage. I didn't call for him. I knew I needed to open this entirely on my own. I slid my thumb under the seal of the envelope and carefully tore it open. I fully braced myself to pull out pages and pages of manic handwriting, desperate apologies, or angry accusations. But when I tilted the envelope over the wooden table, absolutely no paper fell out. Instead, a single, delicate object slid out of the envelope and landed softly on the surface of the table. I stared at it in complete and utter silence. It was a single, perfectly preserved, pressed dried sunflower. There was absolutely no letter attached to it. There was no sticky note, no greeting card, and no hidden message written on the inside of the envelope. There were absolutely no words at all. Just the bright yellow petals of a dried sunflower, flattened carefully over time. The absolute magnitude of what that single flower meant hit me like a physical wave. My mind instantly flashed back to the very first massive argument we had over the wedding planning exactly 1 year ago. I had specifically begged her for a rustic, relaxed vibe with lots of bright sunflowers. She had gone behind my back, completely canceled my floral order, and replaced them with expensive, imported white orchids. She had coldly looked me in the eye and told me that sunflowers were cheap and tacky, and she would never allow her friends to see such an ugly display associated with her pristine reputation. The sunflower was the exact catalyst that started her entire campaign of control, which eventually escalated into her trying to destroy my life. And now, here it was, sitting right on my kitchen table, She didn't write an apology because Caroline Whitmore was fundamentally incapable of admitting out loud that she was wrong. Her pride, even in her absolute isolation and social ruin, would never allow her to pen the words, "I am sorry," or "you were right." But this single, dried sunflower was the absolute closest thing to a concession I would ever receive from her. It was her silent, painful acknowledgement that she had heard my final letter. It was her way of telling me that she remembered exactly what I had wanted all along, and that she finally understood that her obsession with white orchids and high society perfection had cost her the only child she had. She had pressed that flower, sealed it in an envelope, and mailed it to me as a quiet, definitive surrender that I sat there looking at the dried petals for a very long time. I didn't cry. I didn't feel the urge to pick up the phone and call her to break the silence. The boundary I had set was still firmly in place, and this flower didn't change the massive amount of damage she had caused. But it did provide the absolute final piece of closure I didn't even know I was waiting for. The war was officially over, and she had finally laid down her weapons. Ethan walked into the kitchen a few minutes later, wiping his dusty hands on a rag. He stopped when he saw me sitting at the table, staring at the envelope and the flower. He walked over, stood behind my chair, and put his heavy, warm hands on my shoulders. He looked down at the table, instantly recognizing my mother's handwriting on the envelope, and then he looked at the pressed sunflower. He didn't ask me any frantic questions, and he didn't get angry. He just quietly asked me if I was okay. I reached up, covered his dusty hand with my own, and leaned my head back against his chest. I looked at the sunflower one last time, feeling a profound, absolute sense of peace settle over my entire life. I told him, completely honest for the first time in my life. I really am. I never replied to the envelope, and my mother never sent another one. I took the dried sunflower, placed it carefully inside the pages of my favorite heavy history book, and put it on a high shelf in the living room. It wasn't a trophy, and it wasn't a decoration. It was just a quiet, permanent reminder of the massive storm we had survived, the boundaries we had built, and the beautiful, unshakable life we had created out of the wreckage.